In this session of IntelliQuest's The World's 100 Greatest People, we are going to learn about a man who was so overwhelmed by his own ambitions and achievements that he ceased to believe he was a man and believed instead that he was a god. His name was Alexander the Great. Alexander was the first king in history to be called great, and it's easy to understand why. He was one of the most skilled generals in history, one of the most powerful personalities, and most importantly, he conquered the entire Persian Empire, including Asia Minor, Syria, Egypt, Babylonia, and Persia itself, in what is considered to be the greatest conquest of ancient times. The reign of Alexander marked the beginning of the Hellenistic Age, when the culture of ancient Greece was spread throughout most of what people believed then was the civilized world. Alexander himself was from Macedonia, a kingdom located in the area that is now comprised of Greece, Bulgaria, and the former Yugoslavia. During a period of about 10 years, from 334 to 324 BC, Alexander built Macedonia into a leading world power. In all the lands he conquered, he established a network of military settlements, many of which later developed into major cities. The most important of these was Alexandria, Egypt, which Alexander founded and named after himself. It was a habit of Alexander's to name all new cities after himself. There were 70 Alexandrias in the world when he finished his work, but of those, only the one in Egypt has survived. Alexander also stabilized the economy of the whole Mediterranean area by establishing a system of coins based on a silver standard. That strengthened trade throughout the region. When he released vast amounts of bullion from the treasures in Persia, the economy was strengthened even further. As a general, Alexander's abilities have never been surpassed. His versatility and his ability to adapt to new situations were perhaps his strongest asset. He was constantly developing new techniques, innovating strategies, and building equipment and arms to meet of his varied enemies. He also knew how to use every twist and turn to his own advantage. His imaginative use of his cavalry was so effective that he seldom had to even use his infantry. In his empire, which stretched from the Mediterranean Sea to India, Alexander spread both fear and enlightenment. His successes took a heavy toll in human life and suffering, yet he also brought learning and knowledge to his empire. His personal interest in science and geography brought many advances in those fields. Most significantly, he also introduced the ideas and customs of Greek culture to Western Asia and India, and he accomplished all of this in a lifespan of only 33 years. From the very start, the stories and legends around Alexander became a blend of fact and fiction. He was a hero of epic proportions, even while he lived. How true the many stories about him are is sometimes difficult to determine. But we know, by the very fact that they exist, that he must have been an extraordinary personality. It is clear he was a military genius and a gifted leader. It must also be true that his personality was magnetic, electrifying. He inspired tens of thousands of men, many twice his age, to follow him on arduous treks across mountains and deserts and into battles with unfamiliar foes on foreign terrain. His troops endured incredible hardship and overcame the greatest obstacles, all because of their loyalty and trust. Alexander was not only obeyed, he was deeply loved. This alone raises him above almost all the other conquerors and kings who both preceded and followed him. Alexander was born in the year 336 BC in Pella, the capital of the Kingdom of Macedonia. Royalty and mythology were already in his blood. His father was Philip, king of the Macedonians and conqueror of Greece. His mother was Olympias, a brilliant and fiery princess from Greece who adored Alexander and who early on instilled in him a strong sense of destiny. It was Olympias who told Alexander he was descended from Achilles, the hero of the Trojan Wars. Throughout his life, Alexander kept two items under his pillow at night, a knife and a copy of Homer's famous epic on the Trojan Wars, the Iliad. He had memorized the Iliad cover to cover. Alexander's father also helped promote the boy's sense of destiny by telling him that all Macedonian kings were descendants of Hercules, who in Greek mythology was the son of the god Zeus. Hercules was known for his strength and his ability to do the impossible. When he was a youth, Alexander too seemed able to do the impossible. He proved that to his father and a large group of spectators one day when he came face to face with a feisty black stallion that would become almost as famous as he would. The horse was intended for the Macedonian cavalry, but although it was beautiful, none of the king's men could mount it. Philip was just about to send the horse away when Alexander interrupted and begged to have his own chance at calming the beast. His father, thinking it might teach Alexander a lesson, agreed, on the condition that when he failed, he would have to pay his father the horse's value. Alexander walked towards the horse, who immediately kicked and reared. The boy saw that the horse was frightened of its own shadow, so he took it by the reins and turned it towards the sun. He let it catch its breath, and then he jumped on its back. The horse galloped away, slowed down, and allowed itself to be led back to Alexander's father. The court broke into wild applause. Philip, who was both stunned and proud, is reported to have said to Alexander, "Seek another kingdom that may be worthy of your abilities, my son, for Macedonia is too small for you." Alexander named his horse Bucephalus, which means ox head, because the black steed had a white mark on its forehead that resembled an ox head. For the next 18 years, whenever Alexander went into battle, Bucephalus was with him. It carried him as far as India, where it died suddenly in the middle of a battle. Alexander erected a city there, and for once he did not name the city Alexander. He named it Bucephalus. Sometime around 343 BC, when Alexander was about 13 years old, Philip hired a tutor for him. This was no ordinary tutor, but a tutor suitable for a descendant of Achilles, Hercules, and Zeus himself. The tutor's name was Aristotle. Aristotle had an interest in science, medicine, and philosophy, and it's probable that he helped kindle a curiosity about plants and animals that Alexander demonstrated his whole life. He may have also encouraged Alexander's interest in other countries and peoples. As a ruler, Alexander was unusually interested in and respectful of the varying cultures in his dominion. Under Aristotle and other teachers, Alexander studied literature, philosophy, politics, and sports, and was trained in physical fitness and exercise. His education followed the Greek principle of a sound mind and a sound body. When he was 18, Alexander had his first opportunity to put his education on warfare to practical use. His father put him in charge of the cavalry at the Battle of Chaeronea, a battle that gave Macedonia control of Greece. Philip's next plan was to invade the Persian Empire in Asia, but his plan was thwarted by his own death. He was murdered in a vague conspiracy that included one of his bodyguards, and may even have included Alexander's own mother, Olympias. At the age of 20, Alexander became king of the Macedonians, and his father's plans to extend his empire into Persia now became his plans. But first, there was business to attend to at home. The new king's first act was to find the conspirators behind his father's death, whom he believed were a group of princes, and to order their executions. Then he executed all his rivals. During this time, he also visited the oracle at Delphi, northwest of Athens. It was believed God spoke directly through the priest or priestess at such an oracle and would reveal the future of those who came seeking it. Alexander went to the priestess at Delphi only to be told by her that the god Apollo could not be approached that day. Alexander, who never responded well to a refusal, grabbed her by the hair and dragged her to the altar. There she gave him her prophecy. "My son," she said, "you are invincible." This invincibility would soon come in handy. After Philip's death, some of the Greek cities under Macedonian rule revolted. One of the most rebellious was Thebes. Alexander marched his troops towards Thebes, covering 100 miles of mountain passes in only 6 days. These swift marches would later become one of his trademarks. He arrived at the gates of the walled city and offered to accept a surrender. When the citizens refused to surrender, he stormed the walls. 6,000 Thebans were killed and 30,000 others were sold into slavery. Alexander then had the city leveled to the ground, sparing only the temples and the house of Pindar, the famous lyric poet. He would try to make amends for this violence the rest of his life. Whenever he came across Thebans, he offered them help in exchange for destroying their home. The destruction of Thebes was meant to serve as a warning to other rebellious Greek cities. It worked. With Greece under control again, Alexander turned his attention to his father's plan to invade Persia. He started for Persia in 334 BC with an army of 35,000 men, both infantry and cavalry, of whom 14,000 were Macedonians and 7,000 were Greeks. It would prove to be one of the most remarkable armies in history, notable most of all for its combination of armaments and talents. There were archers, javelin men, a superb cavalry that was the core of the unit, and an infantry that carried 13-foot spears and shields. Accompanying them were surveyors, engineers, architects, scientists, court officials, and historians. It was an army designed to establish an empire. First, Alexander led his men to Troy, where they could honor Achilles, his hero from the Iliad, and his alleged ancestor. Then he led them east in search of his own epic adventures. As the army traveled from Europe to Asia, the Persians sent out troops to meet them. The two forces came face to face at the Granicus River in northwest Turkey. Alexander and his cavalry charged across the river. Alexander perched high on his beloved Bucephalus, 2 white plumes atop his helmet. He charged up a riverbank toward the Persian leader he'd chosen for battle. He killed the man with his spear and was just about to be killed himself by another Persian scimitar when his friend Clytus appeared and cut the man's arm off. The Persians eventually fled and Alexander won the battle. It was this pivotal battle that opened all of Asia Minor to Alexander the Great. Alexander gave special funerals for his men who died in battle. He also had their statues cast in bronze and gave their families tax-exempt status. After a battle, he always visited the wounded as well, encouraging them to tell him their brave deeds on the field. After Granicus, Alexander's troops continued along the southern coast of Asia Minor, then headed north for the city of Gordium, near what we now know as Ankara, Turkey. It was here that one of the most famous legends about Alexander would be born, the legend of the Gordian knot. A chariot said to be that of King Midas was fastened with thick cords made from the bark of a cornel tree. An ancient prophecy had declared that whoever could untie this complex knot would become the ruler of all Asia. The knot was so cleverly tied that no ends were visible. Alexander first tried to find the ends by looking beneath the chariot. Unable to find them or untie the knot, he drew his sword and with one slash severed it. One of his historians wrote, "There were thunderclaps and flashes of lightning that very night." From Gordium, Alexander marched south, but he soon developed a bad chill and fever that brought him close to death. The doctors were afraid to treat him for fear of the reprisals if their patient died. But one doctor named Philip, confident of his medicine, offered to help. Alexander sent for him. The doctor arrived with his potion, and as he did, Alexander was reading a letter that claimed Philip intended to poison him. He took the potion from Philip at the same moment that he handed him the letter, and as Philip read, Alexander drank. Philip was appalled by what he read and hastened to deny it. Alexander stopped him. He finished the potion, put the cup down, and smiled. He had trusted Philip, and he had risked his life to prove that trust. Within a short while, he was fully recovered. Alexander led his men to the coast of Syria, where he hoped to meet in battle with his mighty opponent Darius III, king of Persia. Darius, too, was marching towards Alexander. The 2 armies passed each other at night, a mountain range between them. Now Darius was behind Alexander, in a town called Issus, near the border of Turkey and Syria. Darius was disappointed when he found out only sick and wounded Macedonian soldiers had been left behind to recuperate. His own soldiers strode up and down the field hospital, cutting the hands off the Macedonian soldiers. Citizens of Issus were so repelled by this that they sent word to Alexander. Upon hearing the news, Alexander immediately ordered his exhausted soldiers to turn around and march to meet Darius on the coastal plain between the mountains and the sea. The battle near Issus was long and fierce. Alexander led the cavalry atop Bucephalus and crashed through the Persian line. He was after Darius, but Darius saw him coming and fled. In the end, Alexander won the battle, but Darius evaded capture. Alexander and his troops chased Darius for several days, but he always eluded them. He had even deserted his mother, wife, and daughters. Alexander treated this royal family with courtesy, ordering that they continue to receive all the respect they were accustomed to. With his best friend, Hephaestion, he went to visit the Queen Mother. Hephaestion entered her tent first, and the Queen mistook him for the great Alexander, whom she'd never seen. She knelt before him, and then, realizing her mistake, became frightened about how angry she might have made Alexander. But when she turned to apologize, Alexander, smiling, said, "Never mind, he too is Alexander." It is said that Hephaestion and the horse Bucephalus were the only 2 beings that Alexander the Great truly loved. Following the battle near Issus, Alexander turned his army south towards Phoenicia and captured several important naval bases and port cities. One of these cities, called Tyre, still bears witness to the brilliance of Alexander's strategy. Tyre stood on an island about half a mile out from land. Unable to capture it by sea, Alexander came up with a bold and imaginative plan. He ordered his engineers to build a causeway to the island, thereby transforming it into a peninsula. Then, armed with catapults, battering rams, and mobile towers, they crossed the causeway and attacked. The Tyrians put up a strong fight, but after several months they were forced to surrender. The women and children of Tyre were sold into slavery, and many of the men were killed. Despite the carnage, the storming of Tyre is considered Alexander's greatest military victory. The enormous machines he used in his siege introduced an entirely new age of warfare. And today, Tyre is still a peninsula, reachable by the very same causeway that Alexander and his troops built. While the siege of Tyre was occurring, King Darius sent an offer to Alexander. He would pay him a huge ransom and would give up all his territory west of the Euphrates if Alexander would leave in peace. This offer was the source of a famous exchange between Alexander and his second-in-command, Parmenio. When Alexander asked for advice on the ransom, Parmenio said, "If I were Alexander, I would accept these offers." To which Alexander replied, "So would I, if I were Parmenio." The offer was refused. Following the victory at Tyre, Alexander headed for Egypt, a far easier conquest. The Egyptians had been unhappy under Persian rule, and they welcomed Alexander as their liberator. In fact, they crowned him Pharaoh. It was during this time, in 331 BC, that the new Pharaoh founded a city on the western edge of the Nile Delta and christened it after himself, Alexandria. He recruited the famous Greek architect Dionysius to design it. He himself mapped out the street patterns using grain. When birds flew down and pecked at the grain, Alexander took it as a bad omen. He referred to his seers, who told him that, to the contrary, it was a good omen. It indicated that the people of his new city would be prosperous and well-fed. While in Egypt, Alexander also sent an expedition of scientists to discover the cause of the flooding of the Nile. Then Alexander began a long, strenuous trek through the Saharan desert of Libya. His faithful men followed him to the oasis of Siwa, where Alexander, ever hungry for proof of his divinity, consulted the oracle of the god Ammon. He never spoke of what the oracle told him, but legend has it that the oracle pronounced he was the son of the Ammon himself, and that he would become a god. It was now 331 BC, and the aspiring god-king set out once again to meet his mortal adversary, King Darius. This time it would be on the plains of Persia, just east of the Tigris River. Darius's forces far outnumbered Alexander's, but Alexander had other advantages: daring strategies and well-trained troops who could not be matched for their dedication. Darius was forced to flee yet again. He escaped into Media, leaving his kingdom once and for all to the young Alexander. This battle, called the Battle of Gaugamela, after a nearby village, ended more than 2 centuries of Persian rule in Asia. At the time, Alexander was 25 years old. There were still more battles to come. Next, Alexander captured the fabled city of Babylon, and then the capital of Persia, Susa. His army then headed for Persepolis, where it seized the royal palaces and confiscated a storehouse of gold and silver. Before leaving, Alexander ordered his soldiers to burn down the palaces of Xerxes, a former king of Persia who had invaded Greece. Although tradition has it that this was done in one of his common drunken revelries, there were other reasons. One was that Alexander, on his approach to the city, had seen the slaves of Persepolis fleeing the city. He had been horrified by their hideous appearance, which was described by one of his men this way: "All had been mutilated. Some lacked hands, some feet, some ears and noses." They were men who had learned skills and crafts and had done well in training, after which their other extremities had been cut off, and they were left with only those on which their work depended. If this wasn't reason enough for Alexander's ferocity, there were other, more practical reasons. There had been a major uprising in Greece, and Alexander hoped the destruction of Persian palaces would mollify them. Still others believed that Alexander intended it as a last and final act of revenge that would pave the way for unity. His views on the empire had been changing. He now hoped to achieve a cooperative government in which Macedonians and Persians ruled together. It was now spring in the year 330 BC. Alexander swung north towards the Caspian Sea in pursuit of Darius. Darius began to gather troops to fight Alexander, but he found few men willing to face the conqueror. One of his own noblemen, a governor named Bessus, opposed Darius's plans and promptly assassinated him. He then named himself king, but few recognized him as such. It was clear to everyone in the empire the new king of Asia was Alexander the Great. His father's advice that Alexander find a kingdom worthy of him had not been in vain. Alexander sent for the body of his foe and had it buried with due honors in the royal tombs at Persepolis. Alexander almost always took care to give his enemies in death the honor they had earned in life. He often arranged funerals for them and saw to the welfare of their families. It was an extension of the same respect he showed his own men. He made every effort to make their lives as comfortable as possible and to minimize their danger. He knew thousands of his soldiers by name. He rewarded any act that contributed to the army's success, whether it be a brave sacrifice in battle or the simple willingness to carry extra supplies. Following the death of Darius, Alexander continued to Bactria and across the Hindu Kush mountains. He sent one of his generals in pursuit of Bessus, Darius's assassin. Bessus was captured, flogged, and sent to Bactria, where he was punished in the traditional and gruesome Persian manner. His nose and ears were cut off, and then he was publicly executed. In Bactria, Alexander took another wife, a princess named Roxana, daughter of a local chieftain. But it was not love or passion that motivated the conqueror. He hoped the alliance would prevent rebellion among Persians in the northeastern and central regions. During this time, Alexander was having trouble with revolts in mountain regions of Persia, and he was also having trouble among his own men. There were rumors that Parmenio, his second-in-command, had been plotting along with his son to kill Alexander. Alexander had them both executed. Then he eliminated all of Parmenio's associates, and finally he promoted the men close to him that he could trust. He divided his cavalry into two sections, and put one in the command of his devoted childhood friend, Hephaestion. The other he put in command of another old friend, Clitus, the man who had saved his life at Granicus. Everything in order again, he pressed westward. During these years in Central Asia, Alexander's behavior began to change, and his sense of his own divinity became more pronounced. He adopted the customs of the Persian kings and demanded that the people bow prostrate at his feet. His Macedonian nobles and many of the Greeks found this request ridiculous. Alexander was a fellow warrior, not a deity. To the Greeks especially, bowing was an act of worship. Some merely laughed at his demands. Others became angry. There were plots against Alexander's life, and in response he executed several prominent Greeks and Macedonians. Among them was the nephew of his former teacher, Aristotle, who had joined the expedition as its official historian, but who had refused to follow Alexander's command to bow. He was killed shortly after on the grounds that he had been part of a conspiracy. There was another murder around this time in the village of Maraconda. It was a murder that increased the strain between Alexander and many of his Macedonians, and it was a murder that Alexander committed with his own hands. There had been a banquet, and like most of Alexander's banquets, all the diners had ended up drunk. At some point, Alexander got into a heated argument with Clitus, one of the commanders of the cavalry, and the friend who had saved Alexander's life in the Battle of Granicus. Clitus insulted Alexander, and in a rage, Alexander rose and drove his spear through Clitus's heart. There was no event in Alexander's life that caused him more remorse than this one. He refused to eat, and he refused to leave his tent. The army grew so worried about him they passed a decree saying Clitus had been guilty of treason and deserved to die. Finally, Alexander emerged from his tent. That tragic matter somewhat resolved, Alexander set out to invade India. He sent some of his troops through the Khyber Pass, and he led the others through the hills to the north. In one battle, he used yet another new and innovative strategy, elephants. He lined them up in front of his cavalry, knowing they would frighten the horses of the enemy who were unfamiliar with the huge beasts. Then Alexander caused panic among the elephants, causing them to trample the enemy troops. The soldiers retreated, and Alexander was victorious yet again. In June, Alexander fought his last great battle on the left bank of the Hydaspes. It was in this great battle that his beloved horse Bucephalus fell. Alexander erected two cities on the spot, one named after himself and one named after his faithful steed. Then he urged his men still further into India. It was an astounding idea. India at that time was really twice as big as any map showed it to be. He marched his men literally off the maps they had into what they called the Outer Ocean, an ocean Greeks believed lay at the end of the world. No one knew what to expect, yet bravely they carried on. Alexander gathered the biggest force of his career, 120,000 men from all over his new empire. He ordered them to travel lightly, burning his own wagon of possessions as an example. By 326 B.C., Alexander had reached what is now Pakistan, but still he wanted to forge ahead toward the Ganges River. For the first time his troops mutinied. They were exhausted and the tropical rains had begun. Finally, Alexander gave in and agreed to lead them westward towards home. But before he left, he erected 12 altars to the 12 Olympian gods and ordered his men to build a fleet of 1,000 ships. Alexander wanted ships so that part of the army could sail home and explore the northern shore of the Arabian Sea and the Persian Gulf. He was researching a coastal route to Mesopotamia. The rest of the troops, Alexander in the lead, headed down the riverbanks on land. There was much fighting along the way. At the storming of one town called Malai, Alexander received a severe wound which left him greatly weakened. An arrow ripped through his chest wall and his lung collapsed. He continued to fight, but eventually lost consciousness, causing panic among the soldiers who thought he was dead. He was moved to a camp 10 miles away from the base camp to recover, but his absence only sparked more rumors that he had died. When Alexander realized this, he had his men cart him to a ship on the river where the soldiers could see him. Their response was recorded by one of his admirals. He raised his hand to the crowd, and they cried aloud, some holding up their hands to heaven, some towards Alexander, and uncontrollable tears were shed in their astonished joy. Some of the bodyguards brought him a litter as he was being carried off the ship, but he ordered a horse to be fetched to him, and when he mounted it and everyone saw him, the whole army clapped their hands repeatedly. Then when he was near his tent, he got off his horse, so the army could see him walking. They all ran to him from every side, some touching his hands, some his knees, some his clothing. Others just looked from nearby and blessed him as he went. Some threw garlands on him. When he recovered, Alexander led his troops across the desert of Gedrosia in southern Iran. He chose this route because he wanted to emulate mythical figures who were said to have made the same journey. It was a disastrous decision. There was little water and a shortage of food and fuel. Many, especially women and children, perished when there was a sudden monsoon while they were encamped at a wadi, a ravine that is a dry riverbed. By the time they emerged from the desert, over half of Alexander's men had died, more soldiers than had died in all of his battles put together. During the march across the desert with his thirsty army, a soldier had approached Alexander and, kneeling down, had offered his king a helmet full of water. "Is there enough for 10,000 men?" Alexander asked. When the soldier replied no, Alexander poured the water onto the ground. Emerging from the desert and back into Macedonia, Alexander discovered that his control over his empire had been weakened. His long absence and rumors of his death had given rise to rebellion and conspiracies. Alexander executed many of his governors and officials and replaced others. He also sent many of the Greek mercenaries and the armies of his governors back to their home cities, creating a financial crisis for thousands of dismissed soldiers and putting a tremendous burden on the cities that had to welcome them back. In an attempt to obtain concessions, the Greeks offered him deification. After a long debate in Athens, the deification was passed, although not without resistance. The decree issued in Sparta read, "Since Alexander wishes to be a god, let him be a god." Alexander was now officially a deity, as the oracles had foretold. From Babylon, Alexander spent time working on the administration of his vast new domain, for which Babylon would be the capital. While there, he planned expeditions to northern Africa and Arabia. He developed plans for trade and commerce and tried to promote greater cooperation between his Macedonians and the conquered Persians. At Susa, Alexander held a great feast to celebrate his victory in Persia, and at the end of the feast, he and 80 of his officers took Persian wives. Alexander married one of Darius's daughters, and his good friend Hephaestion married another. The marriages were designed to promote a sense of unity, but instead it created tension with many of the Macedonians. They had already become anxious when Alexander recruited Persians into his army and had given many of them prominent posts. Now anxiety was beginning to turn to anger. Matters got even worse when Alexander performed a mass wedding ceremony in which thousands of his soldiers married Persian women in exchange for rich wedding gifts. He was not only trying to end the national and cultural prejudices that threatened his plans for a united empire, he also hoped these marriages would produce a new generation of mixed-blood nobles that might form the core of a royal army. After his death, nearly all these marriages were dissolved. The Macedonians saw all these moves as a threat to their privileged position, and there was an open mutiny. Alexander responded by dismissing the whole army and replacing it with Persians. This frightened the opposition, and they quickly sought his forgiveness. There was a large banquet with over 9,000 guests to celebrate the end of the dispute and the beginning of a partnership between Macedonians and Persians. In the autumn of the year 324 BC, Alexander lost the friend who was probably the only person who he truly loved. His boyhood friend Hephaestion, who he'd made his grand vizier, died of an illness in the village of Ecbatana. The loss to Alexander was devastating. He clung to the body for a day and a night. He cut off his hair and ordered all the manes and tails of his horses cut short. He had Hephaestion's doctor executed. He went into a period of deep mourning that frightened his advisers. When he came out, he arranged an expensive royal funeral for his friend, sent out general orders that he was to be honored as a hero, asked the priests in Egypt to declare Hephaestion a god, and never again did he fill the vacant seat of Grand Vizier. Alexander never fully recovered from the death of Hephaestion, and the loss may have contributed to his own death only months later. When he finally emerged from his mourning, he embarked on a winter campaign in the mountains, and then returned to Babylon to plan for his conquest of Arabia. In the spring, Alexander became ill with a fever after a prolonged banquet and drinking bout. His condition was probably worsened by exhaustion and the effects of several battle wounds. Soon he developed pneumonia, and it was clear he wouldn't live. Thousands of soldiers filed by his bed, and Alexander managed to nod or raise a hand to each one. A general asked him, "To whom do you leave your kingdom?" And Alexander responded, "To the strongest." Later he was asked at what time he wanted his divine honors paid him, and he was said to reply, "When you are happy." They were his last words. He died 10 days after becoming ill on June 10, 323 BC, at the age of 32. The embalmers, before preparing his body, prayed that it would be right for them to handle the body of a god. His body was placed in a golden coffin and escorted to Alexandria, where it was placed in a special tomb. There was no individual who had the energy and force to follow Alexander and see his dreams to fruition. After he died, his half-brother, Philip III, became king of Macedonia. A son, Alexander IV, was born shortly after Alexander died, and when he was a young boy, he shared the throne with Philip. Both were murdered, Philip in 317 BC and Alexander in 324 BC, when he was only 13 years old. No one succeeded Alexander the Great in the rule of his vast and dearly won empire. Instead, his generals took over the governorship of various areas, and then began fighting amongst themselves for control. Within 23 years after he died, Alexander's kingdom had split into several different states. There had been other empires before the empire of Alexander the Great, but most had concerned themselves with wealth and power. Alexander, too, had been ambitious and cruel at a time when cruelty was an accepted norm. But he had also demonstrated a generosity and compassion that was not the norm. He had held as virtues friendship, loyalty, and honor in a period of history when such virtues were often considered weaknesses. Alexander had spread fear and even carnage, but he had also spread the high ideals of Greek culture. The Greek civilization was based on the attainment of knowledge and learning, on science and discovery, and on respect for the individual. In all the great philosophy, art, and writings left to us from that period, one theme consistently runs true: the concept of individual freedom. These ideals were the ideals Alexander hoped to incorporate in his empire, an empire where varied cultures and races could join together and pool their talents and skills. It was his own dynamic personality that held together his empire. He combined determination and ambition with a flexible, imaginative mind. He was short-tempered and he could be ruthless, yet he could also be forgiving and compassionate. He had a phenomenal ability to instill loyalty. He was a military genius with a brilliant sense of timing in both war and politics. As a general, he is among the greatest the world had seen, and his own personal interest in science and exploration brought many advances in the territories he conquered. Mythical figures like Achilles, Hercules, and Dionysus were never far from Alexander's mind. He seemed to want to surpass them and attain divinity. In his eyes, the means to that divinity was in the creation of a unified empire. Alexander was the first king to gain acceptance for the idea of a universal kingdom. He created a single world that stretched from Gibraltar to the Punjab. Territories in this world shared trade, a monetary system, social exchanges, and a common civilization. Alexander had, for a brief moment, unified the civilized world and showed that people of different races, cultures, and nations could work side by side. The acceptance for this unified world later paved the way for the Roman Empire. In addition, Alexander opened the Greek world to Eastern influences, which in turn paved the way for Christianity. In this sense, the actions of Alexander the Great affected the course of human history for centuries to come.
This is the end of the session.